So, you've decided that you want to learn how to crochet. Here are a few things that I think you should know before you start. Hi everyone, hope you guys are doing well. This is James from Divine Crochet. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing 8 pieces of information that I wish I knew before I started crocheting. Without going too deep into it, crochet is basically just using a hook and yarn to create a bunch of knots to create fabric. Now that's a very short description of it, but that's kind of the gist as to what crocheting as an art is. Before I started crocheting, my ideas as to what crochet was or what crochet could be was definitely very limited. I suppose this is just because I didn't have an awful lot of exposure to crochet. I feel like a lot of us are more familiar with things like knitting or weaving. And throughout the last year and a half of me crocheting, I've discovered that a lot of my ideas as to what crochet was definitely not accurate. So for today's video, I've compiled everything that I've learned into 8 pieces of information that I believe you should know before you start crocheting. Before we get into the video, make sure you like, comment and subscribe. I post crochet content every week, so if that's your thing or something you want to learn more about, make sure you're subscribed. Also, I've linked all of my social medias down below, so go ahead and check them out as well. Without any further ado, let's go into everything that I wish I knew before I started crocheting. When you start to learn crocheting, you're going to be overwhelmed by a lot of different stitches, but realistically you can do so much by just learning how to do one stitch. I think a lot of people start crocheting and want to learn everything at once, and whilst obviously you can go ahead and do that, in my opinion, it's so much more enjoyable and easier for you to learn how to crochet one stitch and work with that stitch quite a lot. So single crochets is probably the most basic stitch that you should start off learning, and once you've learned how to do a rectangular panel of just single crochets, you can go ahead and make a scarf, you could make a laptop case, you could make a bag, you could make a bookcase, you could make a bookmark. Really, there's a lot of things that you can do with just learning one stitch. Obviously, I know a lot of us want to go ahead and learn everything, but just know once you've learned your first stitch, you can comfortably sit in that and experiment with what you like to crochet just using that stitch. So as soon as you start learning, please do not get overwhelmed by all of these stitches. Realistically, you will learn them in time, but for now, just stick with the one that you like and make whatever you want out of them. For me, that was more enjoyable than trying to learn everything at once. Like, I'm pretty sure I probably made about 20 projects just using single crochet before I then started to incorporate other stitches. My second tip, which kind of follows on from my first piece of information, is that you're going to be better off treating crochet as something you build upon than trying to crochet a specific thing. Now, I know a lot of us start crochet with kind of a thing in mind that we might want to make, whether that's a big stuffed toy, whether that's a certain jumper, whether that's a blanket. We all have that thing that we really want to make, and keep in mind, not every crochet project is going to be able to be made by a beginner. For me, learning how to crochet should be something that builds upon itself. So as a rule of thumb, if you've made your first project and you're looking for your second project, make sure you're kind of learning maybe 1 or 2 new skills at a time. So you could stick with the same stitch, but this time work with increases and decreases. Or if you've learned how to double crochet, you could learn how to do a granny square, but I wouldn't learn how to do a granny square and how to do double crochets at the same time. So you kind of want to stick with things that aren't too much out of your comfort level. So if you are an absolute beginner, please stick to absolute beginner projects until you feel ready to move on. And for me, that was a good few weeks of just making very basic bags, experimenting with changing colors, experimenting with different yarns, just perfecting little things within my crochet. My third tip is you don't want to ignore what yarn and hook size you are using. So I made the mistake of just happily walking into a craft shop, picking up a yarn and picking up a hook, and I said, let's crochet. And whilst I made this work, I definitely made things harder for myself. So here are a few things that you want to look out for when you buy yarn. I can do a completely different video on what you need to buy to start crocheting, but realistically the yarn you want to probably use is an acrylic yarn. Most beginners in crochet get along best with acrylic yarn, and you also want to go ahead and pick a light color. Anything like dark browns, blacks, even navies will be really hard to see. So I'll put up a few examples of colors that you might want to pick. When it comes to picking out yarn, you want to make sure you're picking out something that's not too thick and not too thin. So as a beginner, what I would do is walk into a shop, try and find a lighter coloured yarn and look at the back and look for a hook size somewhere around 4, 5 or 6. Once you find a yarn that you like the colour of, and make sure that you can see what hook size it needs, and it should be, as I say, around 4 to 6 millimeters. You want to go ahead and get a hook that matches the size on the yarn. This is going to be very important because if your hook is too big or too small, learning how to crochet can start to get quite difficult. I'm not going to get into it in this video, but as you learn more about crochet, you'll learn that you can change your hook size to affect how your fabric looks in the end. But please don't worry about that now. Literally just work with whatever hook size your yarn asks for. And again, acrylic is probably going to be your best choice. My fourth piece of information that I did not know about crocheting is how time-consuming crocheting can be. If you're familiar with crafts, I suppose crocheting isn't the most time-consuming craft. What you should be aware of is the bigger the project, the longer it will take to make. And then on top of that, the bigger hook size or yarn size that you use, the quicker you will be able to crochet. So if I was making 2 blankets, one with a thinner yarn and one with a thicker yarn, the thicker yarn is going to be an easier blanket to make because I'm going to have to use less stitches to get the size that I want. So in my opinion, it's not the smartest idea to choose a huge project like a blanket as your first project. And also throughout crocheting, you'll learn that using a smaller yarn size as well as a smaller hook size, even though it may be more time consuming, sometimes yields a better result. But that's honestly another thing you can focus on when you crochet a little bit more. My fifth thing that I did not know when starting crocheting is how much sewing I would have to do alongside crocheting. When you crochet a panel, as long as you're not changing colours or changing yarns, you will tend to have 2 loose ends. And what would happen within crochet is when we make our garment or our bag or whatever we're trying to make, we would have to get those ends and sew them into the fabric. Remember also when you crochet, you'll tend to make a lot of separate pieces that might have to be sewn together. So whilst you're at the shop getting your crochet stuff, just go ahead and get yourself a darning needle or just a needle that doesn't have a super pointy end. For a while, I tried to avoid buying a needle. Unless you're going to have all of your ends dangling or you're not doing any sewing at all, you will need a needle, and that's not really something I considered. I feel like most people are in 2 camps when it comes to this. Some people really enjoy the sewing part of crocheting. Personally, I do not. But at the end of the day, it's all worth it, so I can't complain. And even then, I don't think anyone would ever spend more time sewing than crocheting in a crochet project, so in that way, it's not actually that bad. The next thing that I didn't know about crocheting is a lot of people actually find it very meditative. Like, I find this as well. When I get super stressed, crocheting actually relaxes me, which doesn't really make sense because I don't think crocheting looks relaxing. I mean, especially if you put on a TV show that you like and you have a nice hot drink and you kind of sit there and relax and crochet, it's a really nice way to decompress. And obviously there might be some points whilst learning crochet that things do get a little bit stressful. Still to this day, I will get stressed out about my crochet. On the whole, crocheting is actually quite a relaxing thing to do, which is not something that I was aware of before I started. The 7th thing that I wish I knew before I started crocheting is a lot of crochet isn't as regimented and strict and singular as you might think it is. You know, not only are there different ways of writing crochet where there are US terms and UK terms. Also, a lot of the tips and tricks that you'll see around crochet isn't necessarily better or worse, rather than just someone's preference. So for example, what we do to end our row and to start our new row is something called a turning chain, and this is something that can be greatly varied. So when you start learning how to crochet, there might be pieces of advice that don't really go together, and just know that's fine. You just want to stick with whichever one you prefer and whichever one looks best on your crochet work. It's not something that you can technically do wrong. I mean, I mean, you can do it wrong, but just because someone's giving a tip or a trick doesn't mean the original way of doing it is incorrect, if that makes sense. And finally, the last thing that I wish I knew when I started crocheting isn't something that you're going to have to worry about straight away, but you will find that crocheting uses quite a bit of yarn. Especially if you've worked within other fiber arts, you'll definitely come to realize that you need a lot of yarn to crochet. And past that, especially once you get into crocheting, you tend to hoard a lot of yarn. And not only can this get a little bit wasteful, this can also get quite expensive. So doing things such as scrap yarn projects, which is just using up all the yarn that you have left over from another project, or using secondhand yarn can really help you with this. So I like to go to a lot of charity shops, or one of my grandparents has a lot of yarn that they won't use anymore, so I will sometimes go through their collection. So once you start to get more into purchasing yarn, you might actually want to consider doing a lot of things online or with secondhand vendors, just to save yourself a bit of money and to create a little bit less waste. Also, another part of not wasting is if you have a project that you're not going to finish, just go ahead and undo it. I know it feels wasteful, I know you've put a lot of time into it, but trust me, I have had projects sit in my collection for a year and I've convinced myself that I'm going to pick it up. So just be realistic with yourself, and if you're not going to finish a project, just undo it and use the yarn for something that you're going to enjoy. Fundamentally, even if you don't finish that project and it goes away, everything that you learned whilst creating that project is still in your head, so you haven't wasted time doing that. I suppose the better way to look at it is that you are learning. That is going to be all of my pieces of advice for today. I could carry on talking about this topic, but realistically, I don't want to overload you with pieces of information you don't need. And trust me, you're going to learn a lot through crocheting. It's a really enjoyable art form. Thank you again. I'm going to leave all of my social media links down below. Make sure you like and comment on this video and subscribe if you enjoyed it. I will see you in my next video next Monday. I hope you have a good rest of your week, and I will see you later. Bye.